Dust Hollow, Arizona Territory, spring of 1877. The wind dragged dry heat across the parched earth, rattling the cracked window panes of the weathered shack that squatted at the edge of town like a wounded animal seeking shade. The sun hung low and merciless in the cloudless sky, casting long, fractured shadows across the sagging porch, where broken tools lay forgotten among scattered bottles and the remnants of dreams that had died hard in the unforgiving desert. Inside the ramshackle dwelling, the stench of stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and bitter neglect lingered in the stifling air like a ghost that no amount of desert wind could banish. The walls seemed to lean inward with the weight of failure, and every board creaked with the sound of a man's pride slowly crumbling to dust. William Will Sterling dismounted from his magnificent black stallion in complete silence, his polished leather boots stirring small clouds of dust as he stepped toward the dilapidated shack with the measured stride of a man who owned half the territory and wasn't afraid to collect what belonged to him. His tailored vest and crisp white shirt stood in stark contrast to the poverty that surrounded him, marking him as clearly as a brand marks cattle. He wore no spurs today, their usual musical jingle absent from his approach. He did not need the sound of warning. The man cowering inside that broken-down hovel already knew exactly why he was coming. Will Sterling was not a man who made idle threats or empty promises. At 32, he had built an empire from nothing but determination and an iron will that had never bent, not even under the crushing weight of personal tragedy. His wife had died bringing their daughter into the world, leaving him to raise 6-year-old Lucy alone while managing thousands of acres of prime grazing land and the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. He had learned to be harder than the land itself, more relentless than the Arizona sun, and completely unforgiving when it came to matters of business and debt. The debt he had come to collect today was 6 months overdue, a considerable sum that represented feed for his cattle through the harsh winter months. Money that Tom Collins had borrowed with tears in his eyes and promises on his lips, swearing on his daughter's life that he would repay every cent when the spring crops came in. But spring had come and gone, and the only thing growing on Collins' worthless patch of scrubland was desperation and the bitter weeds of broken dreams. Will knocked once on the splintered wooden door, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence like a judge's gavel falling. The door creaked open before he could knock again, revealing a man whose soul had been as thoroughly broken as everything else he had ever touched. "What the hell do you want?" growled Tom Collins, his shoulders hunched beneath a torn flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His face was carved deep with lines of time, drink, and a fury that never quite faded, no matter how much whiskey he poured on it. What happened next would change 3 lives forever, in ways that neither man could have imagined when the sun rose that morning over the endless Arizona desert. Will spoke without raising his voice, each word delivered with the cold precision of a man who had learned that quiet authority carried more weight than shouting ever could. "It has been 6 months, Collins. I came for what you owe." Tom Collins scoffed, a bitter sound that scraped against his throat like sandpaper, and spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the dusty floor beside Will's polished boots. "I don't have it. That is not my concern." "I said I don't have it," Collins snapped, swaying slightly on his feet as the whiskey that had been his breakfast companion made itself known. "What do you want me to do?" "Bleed silver. The mines dried up months ago. The fields are nothing but dead dirt and broken dreams." "You knew that when you lent me the money." Will's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of his growing impatience. He had heard every excuse, every sob story, every desperate plea that desperate men could conjure when their backs were against the wall and their debts came calling. He said nothing, simply stood there like a pillar of granite, weathered by desert winds, but unmoved by them. Collins's bloodshot eyes narrowed as they darted over his shoulder into the dim interior of the shack, and slowly, like the sunrise of a particularly ugly day, a mean sort of grin began to curl at the corners of his cracked lips. "Wait here," he said, his voice taking on a tone that made Will's instincts prickle with unease. The broken man staggered back into the shadowy depths of his hovel, his footsteps uneven and accompanied by the sound of muttered curses and the crash of something being knocked over in the darkness. A moment passed, then another, and Will remained perfectly still on the sagging porch, the desert heat pressing against his spine while the silence of the shack seemed to grow louder and more ominous with each passing second. The door opened again, this time wider than before, and Collins emerged with something that resembled triumph glittering in his desperate eyes. Behind him, stumbling slightly as she was pushed forward by his rough hand on her shoulder, came a young woman who looked as though she had been carved from desert stone and painted with the colors of sunset. She was no child, Will could see that immediately, but neither was she yet fully grown into the strength that her posture promised. 18, perhaps, with tangled dark hair that caught the late afternoon light and eyes the color of sage after rain. Her feet were bare and dusty, her simple green dress faded and worn thin by too many washings and too much hard living. Yet despite the obvious poverty that clung to her, like the desert dust, she stood tall as any woman could stand, after being dragged from her home like a lamb being led to slaughter. "This one," Collins announced with the air of a man unveiling his greatest treasure, gesturing toward the girl with a casual wave of his thumb that made Will's stomach turn. "Useless as a wife, useless as a daughter, but maybe she can be useful to you." Will's eyes did not flinch from their steady gaze, but they turned with deliberate slowness toward the young woman, taking in every detail of her appearance with the careful assessment of a man who had learned to read character in the set of shoulders and the tilt of a chin. What he saw there made something cold and hard settle in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. "She's 18, Collins continued, his grin widening as he warmed to his theme, like a snake oil salesman who had found his rhythm. "You got land, money, a little girl that needs raising, and no woman to warm your bed? Take her. Call us even." The girl's name was Sarah, though Collins had not bothered with such niceties as introductions. Sarah Collins, who had spent every day of her 18 years watching her father drink away everything of value they had ever possessed, including, apparently, his basic human decency. Her breath caught audibly in the desert air as the full meaning of his words crashed over her like a flash flood in an arroyo. "You cannot be serious," she whispered, her voice carrying the kind of disbelief that came from discovering that the world was even crueler than she had imagined possible. Collins's grin disappeared faster than water soaking into parched earth, replaced by the familiar scowl of a man whose authority had been questioned by someone he considered beneath his notice. "I fed you for 18 years. I put a roof over your head when your mother died birthing you. And for what? You can't even scrub a floor without complaining about your precious hands getting rough. Time you did something useful for once in your miserable life." "No," Sarah said, and her voice was firmer now, strengthened by a core of steel that years of her father's neglect and casual cruelty had not been able to bend or break. "I am not for sale." She turned away from both men, her bare feet moving soundlessly across the weathered boards of the porch as she sought escape from a situation that had spiraled beyond her worst nightmares. But she was too slow, or perhaps Collins was quicker than his usual whiskey-soaked reflexes should have allowed. The slap cracked through the dry desert air like a rifle shot, sharp and final, and echoing off the walls of the surrounding buildings. Sarah fell hard to the splintered porch floor, her cheek immediately blooming an angry red that would darken to purple by morning, her long dark hair falling like a curtain over her eyes as she struggled to process what had just happened. "You ungrateful little brat," Collins spat, standing over his fallen daughter, with his fist still raised as though preparing to deliver another blow. "You're nothing but dead weight, always have been, just like your worthless mother." The silence that followed was deeper and more absolute than any quiet Will had ever experienced, even in the vast emptiness of the desert at midnight. It was the kind of silence that preceded storms, the breathless moment when the entire world seemed to be holding its breath and waiting for lightning to strike. Will Sterling did not speak. He could not have spoken if his life had depended on it, because the fury that was building inside his chest was so pure and so complete that it had stolen his voice and replaced it with something that burned like molten metal in his throat. But he did move, stepping forward with the fluid grace of a predator who had suddenly identified his prey. Collins turned toward him, perhaps intending to throw another insult or make another crude joke about his daughter's market value. But the words died unspoken on his lips when he saw the look in Will's eyes. It was the kind of look that had once preceded duels at dawn and the digging of shallow graves, the expression of a man who had reached the end of his patience and found violence waiting there like an old friend. Will walked past the older man as though he did not exist, his expensive boots making no sound on the creaking boards as he approached the place where Sarah had fallen. He bent down slowly, deliberately, and offered her his hand with a gesture that was somehow both gentle and commanding, the kind of offer that brooked no refusal but demanded no submission. Sarah looked up at him through the veil of her hair, her eyes wide with shock and pain, but not yet surrendered to despair. Her lips trembled with words she did not dare speak, but her pride held firm even in the face of her father's ultimate betrayal. She stared at Will's outstretched hand as though it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, uncertain whether to trust it or whether it would simply pull her deeper into the flood. Will's voice, when it finally came, was pitched so low that it barely disturbed the desert air, but every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. Come with me. It was not an offer. It was not a question. It was not even a request. It was something else entirely, something that sounded almost like salvation, spoken in the voice of a man who had decided that some things in this world were worth fighting for, even if the fight cost him everything he had built. Sarah stared at his hand, then raised her eyes to meet his gaze directly. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her entire life, someone was looking at her not as a burden to be endured or a problem to be solved, but as a human being worthy of basic dignity and respect. Slowly, as though she were reaching across an impossible distance to grasp something that might not be real, Sarah Collins placed her trembling hand in Will Sterling's steady one. The moment their skin touched, something passed between them that neither could have named or explained, but both would remember for the rest of their lives. Will helped her to her feet with the same careful consideration he might have shown a wounded bird, his touch firm but gentle, his eyes never leaving her face. Behind them, Tom Collins stood forgotten, his mouth hanging open as he watched his carefully laid plans crumble to dust in the face of something he had never expected to encounter. Human decency. As Will guided Sarah toward his waiting horse, she found her voice one final time. "What about the debt?" she asked quietly. Will's answer was simple, delivered without looking back at the man who had tried to sell his own daughter like a piece of livestock. "There is no debt. Not anymore." And with those words, Sarah Collins began the journey toward a life she had never dared to imagine possible, riding behind a man whose wealth was measured not just in land and cattle, but in the strength of his character and the depth of his honor. The first time Sarah saw Sterling Ranch, it felt more like arriving at a small town than approaching someone's home. The vast expanse of Will's property stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, dotted with buildings that seemed to rise from the desert floor like monuments to prosperity and careful planning. Rows of well-maintained barns and sturdy bunkhouses formed neat lines across acres of hard-packed earth and wild grass that somehow managed to stay green despite the relentless Arizona sun. Horses stamped and snorted in spacious corrals, their coats gleaming with health and careful grooming, while ranch hands moved with the precision of clockwork, shouting orders and sharpening tools beneath a broad sweep of endless sky. Will said little as he helped Sarah down from his magnificent stallion, his strong hands steadying her as her bare feet touched the ground of what would become her new world. The contact between them was brief, his touch firm and reassuring, then gone before she could become accustomed to the unfamiliar sensation of gentle treatment from a man's hands. He pointed toward a narrow but well-built structure tucked beside the stables, its wooden walls weathered but solid, its small windows clean and fitted with actual glass rather than the oiled paper that had covered the openings in her father's shack. "That's your room," he said simply, his voice carrying neither warmth nor coldness, just the practical tone of a man stating facts. Sarah nodded, clutching the pitiful bundle that contained everything she owned in the world, and stepped inside what would become her sanctuary. The space was modest but clean, smelling faintly of hay and fresh wood, rather than the stale whiskey and despair that had permeated every corner of her father's home. A narrow but comfortable cot occupied one wall, covered with a thick wool blanket that looked warm enough to ward off the desert's surprising nighttime chill. A sturdy wash basin sat on a wooden stand, accompanied by a pitcher of clean water and a bar of soap that still retained its shape rather than dissolving into the slimy remnants she was accustomed to. A single window looked out over the main yard, offering her a view of the bustling activity that kept the ranch running like a well-oiled machine. The blanket was of good quality, the floor was made of smooth wooden planks rather than packed dirt, and there was even a small chest where she could store her few belongings. It was clear that this was not intended as charity or kindness in the traditional sense, but neither was it punishment or deliberate hardship. It was simply a place to exist, to breathe, to be left alone to find her footing in this new world. Just enough space to live with dignity and nothing more. As Sarah unpacked her meager possessions, she became aware that she was being watched. Peeking around the corner of the stable door was a little girl with pale blonde curls and solemn brown eyes that seemed far too serious for someone so young. This had to be Lucy, Will's daughter, the child he had mentioned during that terrible confrontation with her father. The girl watched Sarah with the careful attention of someone who had learned early in life that new people could bring either joy or sorrow, and that it was safest to observe before making judgments. Sarah offered a tentative wave, accompanied by the gentlest smile she could manage. Lucy stared at her for a long moment, then vanished without a word, disappearing around the corner like a ghost who had decided that the living world was too unpredictable for comfort. By the second day, Sarah had begun to understand the rhythm of ranch life and her place within it. She passed the bunkhouse carrying a basket of linens that needed washing, her head held high despite the whispers that seemed to follow her wherever she walked. The voices were low, but not quite low enough to avoid her hearing, each comment designed to cut and humiliate in the way that men often used when they wanted to establish dominance over someone they perceived as vulnerable. "Dat girl's got some curves on her, don't she?" The voice belonged to Boyd Murphy, a thick-necked man who always smelled of cheap whiskey and seemed to take particular pleasure in making others uncomfortable. "Wonder what she's paying the boss with," another voice added, followed by the kind of laughter that made Sarah's skin crawl. Boyd leaned against a fence post with two other ranch hands beside him, his eyes following Sarah's movement with the predatory attention of a coyote watching a wounded rabbit. He tilted his head toward her with a smirk that revealed tobacco-stained teeth and said loud enough for her to hear clearly, "Reckon the boss got tired of sleeping alone." About time he found himself a woman to warm his bed. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't slow her pace, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing how their words affected her. She had learned long ago that showing weakness to bullies only encouraged them to press harder. Instead, she continued walking with her spine straight and her chin raised, carrying herself with the dignity that her father had tried so hard to strip away, but had never quite managed to destroy completely. She scrubbed floors until her knees were raw, hauled buckets of water until her shoulders ached, washed Lucy's sheets with the same care she would have given to Silk, and cleaned the main house in complete silence. She cooked when asked, waited when not needed, and when Lucy inevitably dropped her cup or spilled her milk or knocked over her plate in the way that children do, Sarah only smiled and cleaned up the mess without a word of complaint or reproach. Lucy had initially watched her with the suspicious wariness of a child who had learned not to trust easily, but gradually that suspicion gave way to curiosity, and curiosity slowly transformed into something that might eventually become acceptance or even admiration. But the other residents of Sterling Ranch, particularly the men who worked the cattle and maintained the buildings, seemed determined to make Sarah's life as difficult as possible without quite crossing the lines that might bring Will's attention to their behavior. By the end of the first week, the teasing had evolved into something more dangerous. The casual comments became more pointed, the glances more invasive, and the men began to test the boundaries of what they could get away with in their employer's absence. It was midday, with the sun hanging like a merciless eye in the cloudless sky, when the situation finally escalated beyond words. Sarah made her way to the well with an empty pail, her worn apron dusted with flour from her morning's baking. The simple task of drawing water had become a daily trial since Boyd and his companions had made it their habit to loiter near the well during the hottest part of the day, when the shade was most precious and the opportunity to torment her was most convenient. As she reached for the rope that would lower her bucket into the cool depths below, Boyd stepped directly into her path, his bulk blocking her access to the well, and his breath reeking of the whiskey he had been nursing since breakfast. "Well now," he said, his eyes raking over her with undisguised hunger. "You sure know how to carry yourself, don't you? Like you're something special instead of just another piece of property the boss picked up to settle a debt." Sarah said nothing. She had learned that silence was often the safest response to men like Boyd, who fed on fear and reaction like vultures feeding on carrion. She tried to step around him to simply complete her task and return to the relative safety of the main house, but he moved to block her again. "You don't talk much, do you?" His voice had taken on a tone that made her skin crawl, the kind of tone that preceded actions no decent person should have to endure. "Makes a man wonder what else you're quiet about. Wonder if you make noise when—" He reached out suddenly, his thick fingers brushing against the inside of her wrist with deliberate intimacy. Sarah jerked back instinctively, too quickly, too obviously startled. The bucket slipped from her nerveless fingers and clanged against the stone rim of the well before tumbling to the ground with a metallic crash that seemed to echo across the entire ranch. Boyd's grin widened at her reaction, interpreting her obvious distress as weakness rather than the justified fear it actually represented. "Jumpy little thing, aren't you?" "Don't worry, sweetheart. Old Boyd knows how to be gentle with nervous fillies." Sarah bent quickly to retrieve the fallen bucket, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. But Boyd was faster than his bulk suggested, and as she reached for the pail, he planted his heavy boot firmly on the edge of her worn skirt, trapping her in a position that left her vulnerable and humiliated. "Oops," he said with mock innocence, pressing down just enough to make it impossible for her to rise. "Clumsy me." She tried to stand anyway, unwilling to remain in such a degrading position, but his weight on her skirt made it impossible. As she struggled, he gave her a casual nudge with his foot, not hard enough to cause real injury, but more than sufficient to send her tumbling to her knees in the dust and dirt of the ranch yard. That was when a voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade through silk. "Get your boot off her skirt." Now. Boyd froze as if he had been turned to stone, his face going pale beneath its coating of dust and stubble. Sarah, still kneeling in the dirt, looked up to see Will Sterling standing just a few feet away, one arm curved protectively around Lucy's small shoulders, his jaw set in an expression that could have been carved from granite. No one had heard him approach. No one had noticed him watching. But there he was, and the look in his eyes promised consequences that would be both swift and permanent for anyone stupid enough to test his patience further. Will Sterling set his daughter down with careful precision, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the fury that Sarah could see building behind his eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He walked toward Boyd with the measured pace of a man who had learned that violence, when it became necessary, should be swift, decisive, and utterly final. Boyd opened his mouth, perhaps to offer some excuse or explanation for his behavior. But Will's fist connected with his jaw before the first word could emerge. The sound of knuckles meeting flesh cracked across the ranch yard like a rifle shot, and Boyd collapsed backward into the dust, groaning and clutching his face as blood began to stream from his nose and split lip. Will stood over the fallen man, his expensive clothes unmarked by the encounter, his breathing steady and controlled. He looked around at the other ranch hands who had been enjoying the spectacle of Sarah's humiliation, his gaze settling on each face with the kind of attention that promised long and painful employment consequences for anyone who had participated in or encouraged Boyd's behavior. "Anyone else want to test where I draw the line?" he asked, his voice pitched low but carrying clearly across the sudden silence that had fallen over the ranch yard. No one spoke. Several men found urgent tasks that required their immediate attention elsewhere, and within moments the area around the well had cleared except for Will, Sarah, Lucy, and Boyd, who was still sprawled in the dirt trying to stem the flow of blood from his broken nose. Will turned his attention to Sarah, who hadn't moved from her position, kneeling beside the overturned water bucket. She stared up at him with wide eyes, uncertain whether what she had witnessed was real or simply another desert mirage born of heat and desperation. No one had ever defended her before. No one had ever considered her worth defending. Will offered his hand, the same gesture he had made on her father's porch. But this time, there was something different in his expression. Not just duty or obligation, but something that looked almost like genuine concern. Sarah took his hand and allowed him to help her to her feet, acutely aware of the strength in his grip and the way his calloused palm completely engulfed her smaller fingers. As he pulled her upright, his voice dropped to something only she could hear, a tone so gentle that it seemed to belong to an entirely different man than the one who had just delivered such swift and brutal justice. "If anyone makes you feel unsafe," he said quietly, "including me, you tell me immediately. This is your home now, and you will be treated with respect." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were so completely unexpected. Home. He had called this place her home, not just a temporary shelter or a place to work off an imaginary debt, but an actual home where she belonged and where her safety mattered to someone. Behind them, Lucy stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of childhood, her small fingers slipping naturally into Sarah's free hand, as though such contact was the most natural thing in the world. "Papa," she whispered, her voice carrying the kind of solemnity that children brought to moments they sensed were important. "Is she staying with us forever?" Will looked at Sarah for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face for something she couldn't name. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a promise made before witnesses. "She's staying as long as she wants to stay." From that day forward, the atmosphere at Sterling Ranch underwent a transformation that was both subtle and profound. No one touched Sarah inappropriately again. No one made crude comments about her appearance or speculated about her relationship with Will within her hearing. The whispers continued, but they were conducted in far more distant corners of the property, away from any place where Will might overhear and decide that further examples needed to be made. Boyd Murphy was dismissed from his position that same afternoon, his belongings packed and his final wages handed to him with the clear understanding that he was never to set foot on Sterling property again. Word spread quickly through the territory that Will Sterling's protection extended to everyone under his roof, and that crossing that line came with consequences that were both immediate and permanent. Sarah worked as she had before, but now there was a different quality to her movements, a softness in her step that spoke of someone who no longer had to constantly watch over her shoulder for approaching threats. She smiled when Lucy trailed flour across the kitchen floor while attempting to help with the baking. She laughed when the ranch dog managed to steal an entire loaf of bread from the table and disappear under the porch to enjoy his prize. Small moments of joy that had been impossible when every day was a battle for basic dignity and safety. Lucy had begun following Sarah around the ranch with the devoted attention of a shadow, chattering about everything and nothing in the way that children do when they find an adult who actually listens to their observations about the world. Sarah discovered that she enjoyed the little girl's company immensely, finding in Lucy's innocent enthusiasm a reminder of what she herself might have been like if her childhood had been filled with love and security rather than neglect and casual cruelty. "Miss Sarah," Lucy said one afternoon as they worked together in the garden, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants that would provide vegetables for the ranch through the coming winter, "why don't you have a little girl of your own?" Sarah paused in her work, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I suppose I never found the right person to be a little girl's papa," she replied carefully. Lucy considered this with the seriousness that children brought to adult explanations that didn't quite make sense to them. "My mama went to heaven when I was born," she said matter-of-factly. "Papa says she's watching over me, but I can't see her. Can you see your mama?" "No, sweetheart. My mama went to heaven too, but when I was very small. I don't remember her very well." "That's sad," Lucy pronounced with the definitive judgment of someone who had not yet learned that life was often unfair and that sadness was a permanent part of the human condition. "But now you have me and Papa, so you won't be lonely anymore." The simple declaration hit Sarah with unexpected force, bringing tears to her eyes that she had to blink away quickly before Lucy noticed and began asking questions about why grown-ups cried when children said nice things to them. Every evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains and painted the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Will would stand at the window of the main house and watch Sarah moving through her evening routines. He told himself that his attention was simply the natural vigilance of a ranch owner, ensuring that his property and people were secure. But the truth was more complex than he was willing to acknowledge even to himself. Sarah Collins had arrived at his ranch as a solution to another man's debt, a transaction conducted without her consent or input. But in the weeks since that first terrible afternoon, she had become something else entirely. She had become the person who made Lucy smile every morning and laugh every evening. She had become the woman whose gentle humming filled the kitchen while she cooked, whose quiet efficiency kept the main house running smoothly, and whose very presence had somehow transformed his sterile, functional residence into something that felt almost like a real home again. Will found himself looking forward to the sound of her voice at breakfast, the sight of her working in the garden with Lucy, the way she moved through his house with growing confidence and belonging. The woman who had once been offered like currency had become the only thing keeping his carefully ordered world from falling back into the lonely silence that had defined his existence since his wife's death. But he also knew that Sarah's presence in his home was still fundamentally built on his intervention in her father's debt, and that knowledge troubled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. She was there because he had chosen to bring her there, not because she had chosen to come. And until that fundamental imbalance was addressed, everything else was built on unstable ground. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning the dishes after supper while Lucy played quietly by the fire, Will found himself standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her work with the same careful attention he had once reserved for studying the behavior of wild horses he hoped to tame. "Sarah," he said quietly, causing her to turn toward him with the quick alertness of someone who had learned to pay attention when men spoke her name. "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" "Will," he corrected gently. "My name is Will. And I wanted you to know that your debt to me was paid in full the moment you agreed to come here. You don't owe me anything. Not work, not gratitude, not your presence. If you wanted to leave tomorrow, to go anywhere else and build a different life, I would give you money for passage and supplies to start over." Sarah stared at him, her hands still dripping with dishwater, her expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Will's answer came without hesitation, rising from someplace deeper than conscious thought. "No, I want you to stay. But I want you to stay because you choose to, not because you think you have no other options." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of Lucy's quiet play and the crackling of logs in the fireplace. But beneath those familiar sounds was something new, the possibility of choice, freely given and freely accepted. Rain had fallen hard the night before, unexpected and bitterly cold for late spring in Arizona territory, the kind of storm that soaked through every layer of clothing and left the ground muddy and treacherous, the air heavy with the scent of wet sage and something that felt almost like hope after months of relentless drought. Sarah had stayed out longer than she should have, hauling firewood from the eastern fence line after the delivery boy had failed to show up for his regular run. The wood was essential for the kitchen stove and the fireplaces that would ward off the desert's surprising nighttime chill. And she couldn't bear the thought of Will or Lucy going cold because of someone else's negligence. By the time she returned to the ranch house, her simple dress clung to her skin like a second skin made of ice water, and her lips had turned the pale blue color that spoke of a body fighting to maintain its core temperature. She said nothing to anyone about her condition, unwilling to seem weak or complaining after Will had made it so clear that she was welcome to stay as long as she chose. Instead, she simply changed into dry clothes with fingers that shook so badly she could barely manage the buttons. Quietly prepared dinner for the family with hands that trembled as she worked, and went to bed early with a polite excuse about being tired from the day's labors. By morning, she could barely sit up. Her forehead burned with fever that seemed to radiate from some furnace deep within her bones, and her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps that left her feeling as though she were drowning in the dry desert air. The small room that had become her sanctuary spun sickeningly whenever she opened her eyes, and even the simple act of pulling the wool blanket up to her chin required more strength than she seemed to possess. She curled beneath the thick covering that Will had provided, trying desperately to will the fever away, through sheer determination, but her body had finally reached the limits of what it could endure. Years of poor nutrition, inadequate shelter, and the constant stress of living under her father's unpredictable violence had weakened her more than she had realized. And the previous night's exposure had been the final straw that broke her body's ability to fight off illness. Outside her small window, the ranch stirred to life with its usual organized efficiency. Cattle lowed in the distance, horses whinnied their morning greetings, and the voices of ranch hands echoed across the yard as they began another day of the endless work that kept Sterling Ranch running like a precision timepiece. But inside Sarah's room, silence reigned except for the sound of her labored breathing and the occasional whimper that escaped her lips when the fever spiked particularly high. She might have lain there unnoticed for hours if not for a small figure who had developed the habit of checking on her every morning before breakfast. Lucy Sterling, barely 6 years old but already possessed of the kind of emotional intelligence that some adults never developed, had noticed that Sarah hadn't appeared in the kitchen at her usual early hour to begin preparing the day's meals. The little girl tiptoed across the main house with a metal cup of water clutched carefully in both hands, her small bare feet making no sound against the wooden floors as she made her way toward Sarah's room. She had filled the cup from the kitchen pump, adding a spoonful of the honey that Sarah always said made everything taste better, and she carried her offering with the solemn concentration of someone performing a sacred ritual. Lucy paused at the threshold of Sarah's room, suddenly uncertain about whether she should enter without permission. But when she heard the soft sounds of distress coming from within, her childish hesitation evaporated completely. "Miss Sarah," she whispered, stepping inside with the careful movements of someone who understood that loud noises could make sick people feel worse. Sarah stirred slightly at the sound of her name, her fever-bright eyes fluttering open to focus with difficulty on the small figure standing beside her bed. Her brow was furrowed with the kind of deep discomfort that comes with high fever, and her dark lashes were damp with the perspiration that her body was producing in its attempt to cool itself. Lucy set the water down on the small table beside the bed and studied Sarah's flushed face with the serious attention of a child who had learned early in life that adults sometimes needed taking care of just as much as children did. Without hesitation, she reached for the edge of the wool blanket and pulled it up higher over Sarah's shoulder, tucking it around her with the gentle efficiency of someone who had been on the receiving end of such care and understood its importance. Then, with the matter-of-fact decisiveness that characterized most of her actions, Lucy climbed carefully into the narrow cot beside Sarah, arranging herself so that her small body could provide additional warmth without causing discomfort to the sick woman. "You're sick," she observed with the straightforward honesty that children brought to obvious situations. Sarah managed a faint smile despite the pounding in her head and the way the room seemed to tilt and spin around her. Her voice, when she managed to speak, was barely audible above the sound of wind rattling the window. "A little, sweetheart." "I'll keep you warm," Lucy announced with the same tone she might have used to declare her intention to have eggs for breakfast or to play with her dolls after lunch. It was simply a fact, a decision she had made, and therefore something that would happen regardless of any obstacles that might present themselves. Outside Sarah's small room, the wind rattled a loose shutter with irregular persistence, but inside, a different kind of warmth began to bloom in the silence. Lucy's small hand found Sarah's larger one beneath the blanket, and the child's natural body heat began to supplement the inadequate protection provided by wool and determination alone. Minutes passed in comfortable quiet before the sound of approaching footsteps announced another presence. The door creaked open slowly, and Will Sterling stepped inside, carrying a leather pouch of medicines in one hand and a folded cloth dampened with cool water in the other. He had noticed Sarah's absence from the kitchen and had come to investigate, prepared to provide whatever assistance might be needed. But he stopped abruptly in the doorway, his breath caught halfway between inhale and exhale as he took in the scene before him. There, in the dim morning light that filtered through the small window, lay his daughter curled up beside the woman he had brought to his ranch as a solution to another man's debt. Lucy's small hand rested protectively on Sarah's wrist, and her golden head was pillowed on Sarah's shoulder, as though such intimate contact was the most natural thing in the world. The fevered woman held the child gently, protectively, even in the grip of illness that had left her barely conscious. Her arm curved around Lucy's small form with the instinctive care of someone who understood that children were precious things that needed to be sheltered from harm, even when the person doing the sheltering was in need of care herself. Will said nothing for a long moment, simply standing in the doorway with emotions cycling through his chest like storm clouds gathering and dispersing on a volatile horizon. He had not seen his daughter sleep with such peaceful contentment since her mother had died bringing her into the world. Lucy had spent the first years of her life struggling with nightmares and a fear of abandonment that manifested in an inability to sleep alone. But gradually those fears had faded into a careful independence that sometimes worried Will with its premature maturity. Yet here she was, curled up with complete trust against a woman who had been a stranger just weeks ago, offering comfort with the unconscious generosity that children displayed when they encountered someone who truly needed their help. Will walked quietly to the bedside table and placed the medicine pouch within easy reach, then unfolded the damp cloth he had brought and gently placed it across Sarah's fevered forehead. She stirred slightly at the cool touch, her eyes fluttering open to meet his gaze with the unfocused look of someone fighting high fever. "Will?" she whispered, his name coming out as more question than statement. "I'm here," he replied softly, settling into the single wooden chair that furnished the small room. "Lucy's taking good care of you." As he spoke, Lucy stirred slightly, blinking up at her father with sleepy brown eyes that held no embarrassment or uncertainty about her decision to provide comfort to someone who needed it. "Papa," she whispered, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone she used when explaining something that should be obvious to adults. "Sarah was cold and sick, so I'm helping her feel better." Will reached out with one large hand and gently brushed a wayward curl from his daughter's cheek, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite identify or control. "That's very kind of you, sweetheart." "She takes care of me," Lucy replied with the simple logic of childhood. "So now I take care of her." Will looked down at the two females who had somehow become the center of his carefully ordered world, and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. Sarah Collins had arrived at Sterling Ranch as payment for a debt, but she had given back far more than she could ever owe. She had given his daughter back her capacity for trust and affection. She had filled his empty house with warmth and laughter, and the thousand small gestures that transformed a place to live into an actual home. And now, watching Lucy care for Sarah with the same gentle attention that Sarah had shown his daughter from the very first day, Will realized that what had begun as a business transaction had evolved into something much more complex and infinitely more precious. His family was healing, piece by piece, day by day, around the presence of a woman who asked for nothing and gave everything. The late afternoon sun cast long amber shadows through the kitchen windows of the main house, painting everything in the golden light that made even the most ordinary objects seem touched by magic. Sarah sat on the wooden floor near the stone hearth, a pile of freshly peeled apples in her lap. Her movements slow but steady as she recovered from the fever that had laid her low for nearly a week. The illness had broken 3 days ago, leaving her weak but determined to resume her duties despite Will's gentle insistence that she rest longer. Lucy sat cross-legged beside her on the smooth planks, her small fingers working to braid a piece of colorful yarn into an intricate pattern that seemed far too complex for someone her age to master. They had grown close during Sarah's illness, their bond deepening through shared moments of vulnerability and care. This afternoon felt no different from dozens of others they had spent together, filled with comfortable silence broken only by the occasional observation or quiet laughter. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered when Sarah, without thinking, broke their companionable quiet with words that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, her voice too low for storytelling and too heavy with old pain for childhood ears. "My mama used to braid my hair like that," she said softly, her eyes fixed on Lucy's careful work rather than meeting the child's curious gaze. Lucy looked up from her yarn, her brown eyes serious and attentive in the way that children could be when they sensed that adults were sharing something important. "Where is she now?" Sarah hesitated, her hands pausing over the apple she had been peeling as memories she usually kept carefully buried began to surface despite her best efforts to keep them locked away. The paring knife hovered motionless above the red skin, trembling slightly as her grip tightened. "She's gone like your mama," Sarah replied carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did she get sick too?" Lucy asked with the matter-of-fact directness that characterized most of her questions about difficult subjects. Sarah shook her head slowly, her dark hair catching the golden light streaming through the windows. "No, sweetheart. Mine didn't get sick. She was taken." Lucy's wise eyes stayed fixed on Sarah's face, reading the pain there with the intuitive understanding that some children possessed when it came to recognizing adult suffering. "Taken where?" "My father hit her," Sarah said, the words coming out in a rush as though speaking them quickly might somehow lessen their impact. "She stepped between him and me once when he was angry and drunk. Very angry. He said I had spoken out of turn, that I needed to learn respect." She swallowed hard, fighting back tears that threatened to overwhelm her careful composure. She never stood again after that night. The confession hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire, heavy and acrid and impossible to ignore. Lucy reached out with one small hand and gently placed it over Sarah's larger one, her touch warm and surprisingly steady for someone so young. "I'm sorry," the little girl whispered with the same solemn sincerity she might have brought to a prayer or a promise. Sarah managed a smile that broke unevenly across her face like sunlight struggling through storm clouds. "I learned that pain can be loud, but silence can kill just as surely as any violence." Neither of them noticed the shadow that had appeared just outside the kitchen door, or the way that shadow suddenly went rigid with tension and barely controlled fury. Will Sterling leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded across his chest, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth as he absorbed Sarah's quiet revelation about her past. He had come to ask about supper preparations, a simple domestic question that had seemed perfectly normal until he found himself eavesdropping on a conversation that revealed depths of cruelty he had never suspected. The knowledge that Sarah had watched her mother die defending her, that she had lived with that memory and its implications for years, settled into his chest like a cold stone dropped into still water. Later that evening, thunder rumbled in the distance, like the voice of an angry god, dry and far off, but carrying the promise of change in its deep vibrations. The sky held the threat of another storm, but it was not the weather that had shifted the air inside the Sterling house and made everyone unconsciously tense with anticipation. A knock came at the main door just as the family was finishing their evening meal. Will opened it to find Tom Collins standing on his porch, clothes still stained with last week's dirt and dried sweat, a toothpick rolling between his yellowed teeth, and something triumphantly malicious glittering in his bloodshot eyes. "You have something of mine," Collins announced without preamble, his voice carrying the slurred confidence of a man who had been drinking just enough to feel brave, but not enough to lose his capacity for calculated cruelty. Will's expression remained perfectly neutral, though his hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to the revolver that hung at his hip. "I cleared your debt months ago, Collins. We have no business together." Collins chuckled, a sound like gravel being stirred in a rusty bucket. "I ain't talking about money, Sterling. I'm talking about my girl, my property." The words hung in the desert air like the stench of something dead and rotting. Will's fingers tightened on the doorframe, his knuckles going white with the effort of maintaining his self-control when every instinct screamed at him to plant his fist in the middle of Collins's smug face. "There's a man in Prescott," Collins continued, warming to his theme like a snake oil salesman who had found his stride. "Owns a dry goods store and half the freight wagons that run between here and California. Bernard Whitlock's his name, and he's got more money than sense. Says he'll marry her, sight unseen. Wants someone young and pretty and quiet, someone who won't give him any trouble or ask too many questions about his business dealings." A sharp intake of breath came from behind Will, and he turned to see Sarah standing in the hallway, her face pale as desert sand, and her hands trembling at her sides. She had heard every word, understood the full implications of what her father was proposing, and the look in her eyes was one that Will never wanted to see again as long as he lived. "Sarah's not for trade," Will said, his voice carrying the kind of cold finality that had once ended arguments before they could begin. "Oh, come now," Collins replied with mock reasonableness, though the malice in his eyes never wavered. You've had your fun playing house with her, had your turn at breaking her improper. Now let her do something actually useful for once in her worthless life. Whitlock's offering good money, enough to set me up comfortable for the rest of my days. The casual way Collins spoke about his daughter, as though she were livestock to be sold to the highest bidder, sent ice through Sarah's veins and fire through Will's. But before either of them could respond, Sarah herself stepped forward, moving past Will to face her father directly. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady despite the obvious fear that made her hands shake and her breathing shallow. "I will not go." Collins scoffed, his expression shifting from smugness to irritation at this unexpected display of defiance from someone he had spent 18 years teaching to submit without question. "Girl, you'll do what I say. You always have." "No," Sarah whispered, and then louder with growing strength. "No, I won't." The simple words seemed to echo in the space between them, carrying more power than Collins had ever heard from his daughter's lips. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his weathered features as he realized that the broken, compliant child he had raised was no longer standing before him. "You ungrateful little bitch," he snarled, raising his hand as though to strike her as he had so many times before. "After everything I've done for you, everything I've sacrificed." But his hand never completed its arc toward Sarah's face. Will Sterling moved with the fluid speed of a man who had spent years handling dangerous situations, catching Collins's wrist in an iron grip that stopped the intended blow cold. "Touch her," Will said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of consequences that would be both immediate and permanent. "And it will be the last thing you ever do." Collins stared at Will for a long moment, perhaps finally beginning to understand that he was no longer dealing with a helpless child but with a woman who had found protectors willing to fight for her safety. The silence stretched between the three of them, thick with tension and unspoken threats. Then Sarah moved again, stepping closer to Will rather than away from her father, her choice made clear through action rather than words. She dropped to her knees beside Will, her eyes burning with desperation, but also with a determination that Tom Collins had never seen in her before. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, but her gaze never wavering from Will's face. "Don't let him take me. I would rather die here on this land, in this house, than be sold again like some piece of property that changes hands whenever men make deals." Collins laughed, but the sound was uglier now, tinged with frustrated rage and the bitter knowledge that his carefully laid plans were crumbling before his eyes. "Look at that. Still as dramatic as ever, ain't she? But you listen here, Sterling. That girl belongs to me by blood and by law, and no amount of money you've spent on fancy clothes and soft living changes that fact." Will looked down at Sarah, seeing not the frightened girl who had stumbled onto his porch months ago, but a woman who had found her strength and was prepared to fight for her freedom regardless of the cost. Then he looked back at Collins, and his expression carried a finality that made the older man take an involuntary step backward. "She belongs here now," Will said, his voice like cold iron forged in the fires of absolute conviction. "Not to you. Not to anyone else. Here with me and Lucy, where she is wanted and valued and protected. And if you come to my property again," he continued, stepping forward and forcing Collins to retreat further, "I will not be nearly as civil as I've been tonight." With those words, Will closed the door firmly, leaving Tom Collins standing alone on the porch with nothing but his rage and his thwarted greed for company. The wind howled that night like a wounded animal seeking shelter, carrying with it the dry scent of cedar and something acrid that made the horses restless in their stalls and the cattle bunched together in nervous clusters near the water troughs. It started just after midnight, perhaps from an untended lantern in the old supply barn, or a careless ember drifting from the blacksmith's forge, where one of the hands had been making emergency repairs to a broken harness. No one would ever know for certain how the fire began, but by the time the first orange flames began licking hungrily at the weathered wooden walls, most of Sterling Ranch was still lost in the deep sleep that comes after long days of hard work under the relentless desert sun. Sarah was not asleep. She had risen early, driven by an inexplicable restlessness that seemed to pull at her nerves like invisible fingers plucking at guitar strings. Something in the wind's voice had disturbed her dreams, filling them with vague images of danger and loss that she couldn't shake even after opening her eyes. She had dressed quietly and made her way to the kitchen, thinking to prepare an early breakfast or perhaps bake bread for the coming day, anything to occupy her hands and quiet the uneasiness that sat in her chest like a stone. That was when she saw it through the kitchen window, a small orange flicker curling up from the edge of the supply barn's roof. Small and almost innocent looking, but growing with the terrifying speed that characterized all fires in the dry desert air. Her first thought was not of her own safety, or even of the valuable supplies and equipment that the barn contained. Her first thought was of Lucy, who sometimes crept out of the main house when nightmares or simple childhood restlessness made sleep impossible. The little girl had a favorite hiding place in the barn's loft, where she would curl up among the sweet-smelling hay bales with a book or simply to escape the adult world when it became too complicated for her young mind to navigate. Sarah didn't think about the danger to herself or stop to wake Will and the other men who could have handled the emergency with greater skill and experience. She simply ran, her bare feet flying across the hard-packed earth of the ranch yard as the fire roared behind her with increasing hunger and fury. The barn doors were warm to the touch when she reached them, their wooden surfaces already beginning to char and split under the intense heat building within. She forced the heavy doors open against the resistance of warped wood and superheated air, and immediately the acrid smoke poured into her throat like liquid fire. The interior of the barn was a vision of hell, with flames dancing along the walls and ceiling beams, while the air shimmered with waves of heat that made it almost impossible to see clearly. But there, exactly where she had feared she might be, was Lucy's small form curled among the hay bales in the loft, her white nightgown making her visible even through the thickening smoke. "Lucy!" Sarah shouted, her voice already hoarse from the burning air she was forced to breathe. "Lucy, wake up!" The child stirred at the sound of her name, her brown eyes opening wide with confusion and growing terror as she became aware of the inferno that surrounded her safe haven. She tried to call out, but the smoke had already begun to affect her small lungs, leaving her able to produce only weak coughing sounds that were barely audible above the roar of the advancing flames. Sarah fought her way through the maze of burning debris and falling embers, her dress catching fire twice before she managed to beat out the flames with her bare hands. The wooden ladder to the loft was already beginning to smolder, its rungs soft and treacherous under her weight, but she climbed with desperate determination, while pieces of burning hay and wood fell around her like deadly rain. She reached Lucy just as a massive beam cracked overhead with a sound like thunder, sending a shower of sparks cascading down on both of them. Sarah scooped the little girl into her arms, wrapping her own body around Lucy's smaller form as a shield against the burning debris, and began the terrifying descent from the loft while the entire structure groaned and swayed around them like a ship in a storm. The trip back to the barn doors seemed to take hours, though it could have been only minutes. Sarah's lungs burned with every breath, and her skin felt as though it were being peeled away layer by layer by the incredible heat that pressed against them from all sides. The hem of her dress caught fire again, and this time the flames spread up her side before she could extinguish them, searing her skin with agony that made her vision blur and her knees threaten to buckle. But she kept moving, kept Lucy pressed safely against her chest, kept putting one foot in front of the other through sheer force of will and the absolute determination that the child she had grown to love would not die because of her hesitation or weakness. They burst through the barn doors in a tumble of smoke and singed fabric, Sarah rolling instinctively onto the hard ground to smother the flames that still clung to her dress while keeping Lucy sheltered beneath her body. They lay there gasping and coughing, Sarah's dress torn and blackened, her arms and side marked with angry red burns that would leave permanent scars. Lucy clung to her with the desperate strength of someone who had just stared death in the face and been pulled back by another person's courage, her small body shaking with reaction and the lingering effects of smoke inhalation. By the time the alarm was raised and the ranch hands came running with buckets and wet blankets, the supply barn was completely lost. The flames had consumed everything within its walls, leaving only a skeleton of charred beams and a pile of ash that would smolder for days. But the fire had been contained, prevented from spreading to the other buildings by the fire breaks that Will had insisted on maintaining around all the major structures. Will Sterling was out riding the far fence lines when he saw the orange glow on the horizon, his heart immediately leaping into his throat with a terror more complete than anything he had ever experienced. He spurred his horse mercilessly across the rough terrain, his mind filled with images of everything he could lose. Everyone who mattered to him consumed by flames while he was too far away to help or even to die with them. He reached the ranch to find the barn reduced to smoking ruins and a crowd of men working to douse the last stubborn flames with bucket brigades drawn from the well and water troughs. His eyes searched frantically through the smoke and confusion until he spotted them near the main house, and only then could he breathe again. Sarah sat on the porch steps, her burns being tended by the ranch cook who had experience with such injuries. Lucy was curled in her lap, wrapped in a clean blanket, but refusing to let go of the woman who had risked everything to save her life. Both were alive, both were safe, and the relief that flooded through Will's system was so intense that it left him lightheaded and shaking. He leaped from his horse before the animal had fully stopped and covered the distance to the porch in long, desperate strides. Lucy looked up as he approached, her tear-streaked face breaking into a smile that was like sunrise after the longest night of his life. "Papa!" she called out, reaching for him with one small hand while keeping the other firmly attached to Sarah's dress. "Sarah saved me." The barn was burning, and I was scared, but Sarah came and got me out. Will dropped to his knees beside them, pulling both Lucy and Sarah into his arms with a desperation that spoke of a man who had just realized how much he had to lose. He held them close, his face buried in Lucy's hair, while his hand gently touched Sarah's shoulder, feeling the solid reality of their presence and the steady rhythm of their breathing. "You're hurt," he said to Sarah, his voice rough with emotion as he took in the extent of her burns and the way she favored her injured side. "It's nothing," Sarah whispered, though the pain in her voice belied her words. "Lucy is safe. That's all that matters." Will looked at this woman who had risked her life without hesitation to save his daughter, who had charged into an inferno because she couldn't bear the thought of a child coming to harm, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. The boundaries he had maintained, the careful distance he had preserved between gratitude and something deeper, simply evaporated like morning mist in the desert sun. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying all the emotion he had been holding back for months. "Why didn't you wake me? Why didn't you call for help?" Sarah met his eyes, seeing something there that made her heart race despite the pain of her injuries. "There wasn't time, and I couldn't risk her." The simple words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that went far beyond the immediate crisis. Will reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused palm warm against her smoke-stained skin. "You could have died," and he said. "So could she," Sarah replied simply, and that was unacceptable. In that moment, with the smoke still rising from the ruins of the barn and the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, Will Sterling finally acknowledged what he had been fighting for months. Sarah Collins was no longer just the solution to another man's debt, no longer just the woman who kept his house and cared for his daughter. She was the woman he loved, and nearly losing her tonight had shown him that some things were worth more than all the carefully maintained boundaries in the world. The evening sky was turning copper over the Arizona hills 3 weeks after the fire, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that made even the charred remains of the supply barn look beautiful in the fading light. Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching Will work with a young horse in the corral, her burns healing well under the careful attention of the ranch doctor, but leaving scars that would mark her skin forever as a reminder of the night she had chosen love over safety. Lucy sat at the kitchen table behind her, carefully arranging wildflowers she had picked that afternoon into a small bouquet, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked to get each bloom positioned exactly right. The child had barely left Sarah's side since the fire, as though afraid that her protector might disappear if she wasn't vigilant. "Sarah," Lucy said suddenly, her voice carrying the serious tone she used when asking important questions, "are you going to marry Papa?" Sarah turned from the window, startled by the directness of the question. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" Because he looks at you the way the men in my storybooks look at ladies they want to marry, Lucy replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possessed about adult emotions. And because you saved me, and now you're part of our family forever. Before Sarah could respond, the kitchen door opened and Will stepped inside, his hat in his hands and his expression showing a nervousness that seemed completely at odds with his usual composed confidence. He looked at Sarah standing by the window, with the evening light painting her hair gold, then at Lucy arranging her flowers with determined precision. "Lucy," he said gently, "would you go gather the eggs from the hen house? We'll need them for breakfast tomorrow." Lucy looked between her father and Sarah with the knowing expression of a child who understood that adults sometimes needed to have conversations without small ears listening. She gathered up her flowers and headed for the door, but paused at the threshold. "Papa," she said seriously, "if you're going to ask Sarah to marry us, you should probably give her some flowers too. Ladies like flowers." After Lucy disappeared outside, Will stood in the middle of his kitchen, looking at Sarah with an expression that combined determination with vulnerability in a way that made her heart race despite her attempts to remain calm. "She's right, you know," he said quietly, stepping closer. "About the flowers. About everything." Sarah felt her breath catch as he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring that had obviously belonged to his first wife. "Sarah Collins," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his gray eyes. "I'm not asking you to replace Lucy's mother or to fill some role in my house. I'm asking you to be my wife because I love you, because watching you risk your life for my daughter showed me that I can't imagine a future without you in it." He held out the ring, his hand remarkably steady for a man whose entire future hung in the balance. "Come with me," he said, echoing the words he had spoken on her father's porch months ago. "Not as payment for a debt or because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose to build a life with us." Sarah looked at the ring, then at Will's face, then out the window where Lucy was already returning from the hen house with a basket of eggs and a grin that suggested she had been listening from just outside the door. "Yes," Sarah whispered, and then louder, with growing confidence. "Yes, Will Sterling. I choose you. I choose us." As Will slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, Lucy burst through the kitchen door with her eggs and her wildflowers and threw her arms around both adults. "Now we're really a family," she announced triumphantly. And standing there in the golden light of the Arizona sunset, surrounded by the warmth of the home they had built together, Sarah Collins finally understood what it meant to be chosen rather than sold, loved rather than tolerated, and treasured rather than merely endured. If this story of second chances, unexpected love, and frontier courage moved your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible Wild West tales. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever made a choice that changed your entire life? What would you do if given the chance to start completely over? Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest frontier adventures. Until next time, remember that sometimes the best things in life come to those who have the courage to choose love over fear.